everyone. Welcome to the second of 4 workshops for OPPD's 2026 Integrated System Plan, or ISP. My name is Yesenia, or Yessi for short. I am on the community engagement team here at OPPD. I'm the one sending you all those email reminders from WebEx, which, by the way, we did adjust the time of the meeting to go to 6:30 p.m. for this workshop since we have more content to cover, more than any of the other workshops we'll have. But we will be respectful of your time and we'll try to wrap up around 6 p.m. still. But we did want to build in that cushion just in case because the OPPD team and I look forward to your engagement and feedback. So thank you very much for taking part of your evening to be with us. We are recording this presentation for folks that cannot make it in person, and the video recording will be posted on www.oppdcommunityconnect.com/ISP. Regardless of where or how you are listening today, at OPPD, safety is always our #1 priority. So on the next slide, we'll do a quick safety moment. Today, I'd like to talk about being prepared for severe weather. So remember to identify your safe location ahead of time. For tornadoes or high winds, that means an interior room on the lower level, the lowest level, away from windows. Keep an emergency kit stocked with essentials like water, flashlights, batteries, medication, and a portable charger. Finally, make sure your family or team knows the plan and how to contact each other if separated. As we keep safety top of mind, let's move on to our agenda. We'll start by recapping the first workshop, then we'll go over what this second workshop will be about. We'll talk about the modeling framework, also the inputs and the assumptions that will go into account. Then we'll dive into the scenarios that could be developed and analyzed. And before we leave, we'll spell out exactly what we need from you. So we have a lot to go over today. So it's a good thing I have some help. Let's move on to learn about the people behind the project and our speakers, Dan Lanahan, Shannon Coleman, Aaron Burdick, and Femi Sawyer. Dan is our Senior Director of Integrated System Planning here at OPPD. Shannon is our Director of Energy Portfolio Planning. Aaron is our project lead from E3. Those are the partners we brought on board to help us with this project. And finally, Femi. He is our project manager, also from E3. Beyond these people, we have a company-wide effort that is here to support this integrated system plan. I want to give a shout out to our board of directors and executive leaders for their fearless leadership. Also, to the subject matter experts, some of whom you will see on the screen, who are working behind the scenes to make sure your questions get addressed or answered. And finally, thank you to the rest of the project team and technical support that made this webinar a reality today. And we're all here for you today, but you have a job too. And on the next slide, we'll talk about how you can give your feedback. First, live polling. That just means throughout the webinar, we'll have these little surveys that pop up on the screen. It's a feature in this meeting platform in WebEx. It's called Slido. When it's time, I'll give you more instructions on how to use it. The second way to participate is also here during the webinar, and it's that Q&A feature. At the bottom of your screens, within the WebEx screen you're all looking at right now, there should be a question mark on the bottom right. It might have a Q&A next to it, and you might have to click the 3 dots on the bottom to have it pop up. If you have a clarifying question during the presentation, submit it using that Q&A tool. We want to be respectful of everyone's time and we want to stay on topic, so please submit clarifying questions only. And our expert panelists and subject matter experts will work behind the scenes to answer your questions. Now, if you have other questions or comments outside of today's workshop, or if you're watching this recording and you come up with a question, we have a place for you to participate. Which brings me to this third way you can provide feedback. And I've mentioned that website, oppdcommunityconnect.com/ISP. Well, if you go to that page and you scroll down to the bottom, there are 3 options for your feedback. If you have a thought you want us to consider regarding today's information, use the comment feature. If you need us to get back to you, for example, if you have a clarifying question that you thought of during the webinar or while you're watching the recording, use the Q&A tab. There is also a survey tab for those that are watching this recording so that you can participate in the poll questions that our live participants are filling out today. If you are here with us live, you don't have to go back and answer those survey questions or those poll questions again. As a reminder, this recording will be posted on that same webpage, oppdcommunityconnect.com/ISP. Okay, let's move on to talk about what it is exactly that we need from you. You know how to give feedback, but what feedback do we want? We'll review this slide at the end as well so you're comfortable understanding what we need from you and when. We'll want to get your feedback or opinion on the assumptions we designed. Remember, in Workshop 1, we asked you to tell us what you think the future will hold for energy. We use that to make assumptions. Do you agree with these assumptions? Do you agree that certain technology and resources that we're going to go over today will be available or advanced enough? Why or why not? Your participation is critical because we'll use your feedback to set up for the third workshop. So, number one, stay caught up by watching these workshop recordings or reading those executive summaries on the project page. Make sure you give us your feedback today during this workshop using the polls or after today on the comment section on the project page. Number three, since we need your input to set up for that third workshop, we do have a deadline of June 5th for your feedback. And finally, we want to see you at the next two workshops as well so you can continue to participate. Before we jump into the material, let's find out who we have in the virtual room today. This is going to be your first chance today to provide your feedback in a way, and it's an easy practice of that Slido or poll feature. Now, before I launch the poll, really before I launch any poll during the training or this webinar, I'll read the question and show the responses. So the first question is, which stakeholder group best represents your role or organization? We want to know which of these best describes you. So when I launch the Slido, you'll select just one answer. All right. All right. So your options are advocacy group, business or economic development, commercial industrial customer, community or nonprofit organization, environmental organization, municipal/local government, regulatory/policy, residential customer, or OPPD employee. I'm launching the poll now. You should see it pop up. Give you a few moments to answer. All right, I'll give you a few more moments. You should see it on your screens. I think it took a while to refresh. All right, we're seeing the results coming in now. All right, it looks like we've got residential customers, OPPD employees, followed by environmental organizations. All right. If you're on a mobile device, the poll would have taken over your whole screen. So click the back button to get back to the PowerPoint presentation. Everyone else, each poll will stay up until I launch the next one, just an FYI. But regardless of who you are or who you're representing, we want to make sure you're all following along on this journey. So let's move on to our next speaker, Dan, who is going to recap our first workshop. Dan?
All right, well, good evening, everyone. So again, I'm Dan Lenahan, Senior Director of OPPD's Integrated System Planning Area, and I'm pleased to be speaking to you today again about this Integrated System Planning or ISP topic. So regardless of which stakeholder group you fit in or represent, we really appreciate you taking time out of your day to join us this evening. So as mentioned today, I'm going to kick us off with discussing where we're at in our overall timeline of this ISP effort, along with a quick recap of what we discussed in our first workshop a few months ago. And then we'll dive into today's workshop topics on the modeling framework, inputs, and assumptions and scenarios. So on the next slide, so you can see on this slide, we've got a series of 4 workshops planned throughout this year. And we completed workshop 1 in March, which gave an intro to this ISP. Now that workshop recording and slides are posted on our OPPD Community Connect ISP webpage for anyone that missed it or for reference for those that attended it. At today's second workshop, we're going to be doing a deeper dive on our modeling framework, data inputs, and future scenarios. Now, we anticipate this one to be one of the more technically intensive of the 4 workshops. So for those of you that like technical details about electric utility planning and modeling, this is going to be the workshop for you. And after today's workshop, we've got 2 more workshops planned in the second half of this year, where we're going to start to unpack the results from the modeling that we're going to be discussing today. So if we go to the next slide, I just wanted to do a quick recap of the key takeaways from our workshop 1 before we launch into the workshop 2 topics today. So this is the same summary slide we presented at the end of that workshop 1. And those key takeaways were, since we last did our integrated resource planning effort in 2021, we've made significant progress on major electric system expansion to serve our fast-growing community. Now, as part of this year's planning effort, we're going to transition from our traditional integrated resource planning approach to our new integrated system planning approach and framework to integrate both the grid and customer solutions alongside our resource planning to create a more holistic system expansion plan. Also, we mentioned our industry is heavily regulated, so complying with regulatory requirements and OPPD strategic directives have huge impacts on how we plan our system and set up this modeling framework. And ultimately, this ISP is going to conclude with macro level portfolio recommendations focusing on a no regrets approach in our 10-year horizon, including guidance on the transition of our North Omaha station. Now, at the conclusion of our workshop 1, we asked for some feedback on the information we presented. And we received some comments and questions via our OPPD Community Connect webpage portal. I just want to briefly summarize some of that feedback. So we received some comments and questions about different trajectories for electric demand growth, including the type of growth that we're forecasting. We received some questions on our decarbonization goals, including questions on the future of our North Omaha station. And we also received some comments on the reliability of renewable energy sources and how that's considered in the modeling. So at today's workshop, we feel that many of these comments and questions are going to be addressed in some form or fashion today. So we can move ahead to the next slide, where I believe we have another poll question for you.
Yes, I'm back with another poll, and we need your help, everybody, to prioritize. So OPPD has to consider a range of future growth scenarios while balancing affordability, reliability, economic development, regulatory requirements, and community expectations. So, which of the following should be the highest priority when planning for long-term growth? Let's see what the options are here. We have option 1, keeping customer rates as low as and stable as possible. So even if it limits investment in new infrastructure or capacity. Option 2 is investing in system reliability and resilience. This is to ensure the grid can support growth and withstand disruptions. Option 3 would be supporting economic development and commercial and industrial expansion, even if it requires significant upfront investment. Option 4 would be meeting community and environmental expectations. So this is including sustainability goals and local development priorities. And then finally, option 5 is balancing all factors equally without prioritizing one area over another. And I'm launching the poll now. Please select your top one. All right, it looks like in the lead we have meeting community and environmental expectations, and then followed closely by balancing all factors equally. And then number 3 is investing in system reliability and resilience. This is a tough call because there are trade-offs with each. I mean, except the balance option, obviously. But thank you for your feedback. It will help us when we start modeling. So again, thank you. And I wonder, Dan, how does the model consider these priorities?
Yeah, thanks, Jesse. Well, that's a great transition to our next slide here. So part of OPPD's mission and strategic directives are to prioritize all of those items on that last poll question. So today we're going to unpack how we're incorporating all these priorities into our modeling framework, which I'm now going to talk to on the next slide here. So in the last workshop, we presented this slide to introduce the concept of our new integrated modeling framework approach and how this differs from our traditional approach to electric utility planning. So this new ISP approach looks to transition us from coordination to integration across our generation, transmission, and distribution grid and customer solutions to develop a more holistic system plan. So on the next slide, I'm going to discuss this integrated approach in a little more depth. And before I dive into the modeling framework details here, I just wanted to highlight that OPPD's partnered with a leading energy consultant, E3, to help develop this framework and help us perform this ISP. So E3 supported us in our last integrated resource planning effort 5 years ago and is one of the few energy consultants that has experience in ISP development. To help explain this framework today, it's important to understand the major data inputs and primary modeling simulation tools that will be used in this ISP. So starting with the data inputs, we will be providing details today on each one of these key inputs, which include electric demand forecasts, the existing generation fleet characteristics, new supply side and demand side technology options and costs, grid capability to accommodate both load growth and changes to the generation fleet, and then finally decarbonization scenarios. Now there's multiple modeling platforms that are going to be utilized in this study, which are shown in the midsection of this slide. And these platforms are considered best in class and industry standards. Now, some of these platforms focus on generation planning, while others focus on the transmission and distribution grid. And we developed an approach where different inputs and outputs of each of these modeling platforms are integrated together to help optimize system portfolios, as there's no single commercially available modeling software platform that does all this integration and optimization today. Now, each of these modeling platforms in the integrated framework has more detailed info in the appendix slides of this presentation, which will later be posted after this workshop on OPPD's Community Connect webpage for those that are interested in those details. Additionally, everywhere on this slide where you see orange font with an asterisk by it means the material has either been significantly enhanced or is new as we transition from our IRP to this ISP framework. Now, the integration of these different platforms is set up to develop an output that will provide macro level generation and grid expansion portfolios that seek to optimize reliability, affordability, and environmental sensitivity objectives. Now, many of these objectives have regulations that are imposed on us, meaning they're not optional and we have to abide by those. And I wanted to speak a bit more to that on the next slide here. So this is another slide that we showed during our workshop 1, which lists the various regulatory authorities over the electric utility industry and for OPPD. Starting at the federal level, there's multiple regulatory bodies that regulate the bulk power grid reliability, wholesale energy markets, and environmental protections. At the regional level, OPPD is a member of the Southwest Power Pool region, where they dictate regional resource adequacy and grid reliability requirements, oversee regional grid interconnection requests and expansion, and administer the regional wholesale energy market OPPD is in. At the state level, Nebraska is the only 100% public power state in the country. So we have various regulations that dictate retail service area jurisdiction, our obligation to serve within those service area boundaries, and certain approval requirements for new generation and transmission expansion. And at the local level, we have an elected board of directors which governs our rates and sets strategic direction for our utility. Now, in the next few slides, we're going to expand upon the Southwest Power Pool regional resource adequacy requirements, as they have significant impacts on how we plan the generation part of our ISP. And so with that, I'm going to transition this over to Shannon Coleman, OPPD's Director of Energy Portfolio Planning, to discuss the SPP regional requirements more.
Thanks, Dan. Good evening, everyone. On that last slide, Dan mentioned the regulatory environment of the Southwest Power Pool, or SPP. As a load responsible entity in SPP, there's several specific requirements that OPPD has to meet. Primary among these requirements is resource adequacy. Resource adequacy is the ability to maintain sufficient generating capacity and reserves to reliably meet customer energy demand, particularly during peak conditions. There are two important details to review in that definition of resource adequacy. First, the definition mentions reserves, or excess capacity required. SPP calls this the planning reserve margin, or PRM. To determine the PRM, SPP conducts a study of the entire system to determine the amount of excess capacity required above the forecasted peak demand in order to meet certain reliability levels, which in this case is a maximum loss of load of 1 day in 10 years. The PRM is intended to mitigate risks related to unit availability, unit generation, weather, and load variation. The base PRM is calculated using the installed capacity or the maximum output of generation resources on the system, and that margin includes the mitigation of all anticipated risks. The PRM requirement is specific to the summer and winter seasons, as our peak demand as well as unit performance and reliability vary greatly season to season. You can see on the graphic here that the base PRM is currently 16% for the summer season and 36% for the winter season. The higher winter PRM reflects recent challenges with unit performance during winter weather events. The second detail that determines resource adequacy is on the resource side and specifically acknowledges that not all generating resources have the same reliability or ability to serve load during peak conditions. To account for this, each unit is derated from its installed capacity according to its actual historical performance and is assigned an accredited capacity value that's counted toward the resource adequacy requirement. So by derating unit capacity for performance risk, we essentially assign a portion of that 16% and 36% system margin requirement to your unit accreditation. SPP studies the system regularly to determine the PRM, recognizing that the value is likely to change over time as system load and resource types change. But what doesn't change is our requirement to meet resource adequacy, peak demand plus that reserve margin, using the accredited capacity of our portfolio. So moving to the next slide. All right, okay. Particularly as we talk about capacity expansion and portfolio optimization, it's important to acknowledge that our resource portfolio has a need for both capacity and energy. We talk about capacity as the capability of a unit. And just as we discussed on the previous slide, each unit's derated accredited capacity reflects its contribution to system reliability and is the value that we ultimately can apply to our resource adequacy requirements. Dispatchable resources like coal, gas, and storage that SPP can turn on and off receive higher accredited capacity, while intermittent resources that can't be dispatched like wind and solar receive lower accreditation. Energy, on the other hand, is a unit's actual generation over time, which is a function of availability and economics. Units with low variable costs like wind and solar typically generate higher volumes of energy. There's almost always a trade-off between capacity and energy when looking at a single resource, which again is the reason we need diversity in our portfolio. The graphic on this slide shows our currently planned portfolio for 2029, with each resource type color-coded and included as a percentage of the total. The accredited capacity for winter and summer are shown on the left, and the anticipated energy generation is shown on the right. And you can see here that trade-off between capacity and energy. If you look at our gas and oil units, for instance, in gray, they represent a high percentage of our accredited capacity, but a relatively low percentage of our energy generation. And vice versa, wind and solar units in blue and yellow respectively are a small percentage of the portfolio on an accredited capacity basis, but a much larger percentage in terms of energy. So on the next slide, continuing the topic of accredited capacity, the capacity accreditation of renewable and storage resources is measured using a metric called the effective load carrying capability, or ELCC, which, like other accredited methodologies that we just discussed, calculates a resource's ability to contribute to grid reliability during periods of highest demand. An important consideration related to ELCC specifically is how it changes over time. The accredited value a renewable resource is granted today most likely won't be the value it will be granted in the future. And that's impactful to resource planning. Specifically, as the power grid evolves, the ELCC of solar, wind, and storage resources typically declines over time as more of that same type of resource is added to the system. Solar is the clearest example. Because these resources are not dispatchable or controllable, the generation and availability of all solar resources are very coincident. And this coincidence makes each additional unit less effective and less valuable to the system. As more capacity is added, the generation saturates the system during specific hours, and its marginal reliability benefit decreases. Since its generation is always during the same hours of day, each added megawatt is directly applied to those same hours of load. And as the peak load is solved by existing generation, the need and therefore the value of the next megawatt to be added to the system is reduced. There's also a time element that changes the overall system dynamics and needs. As renewable penetration on the system increases, the coincident generation adds up, and what used to be the peak load hours no longer need dispatchable generation. So the hours of highest resource need shift to a different hour of the day. And many times, the resource in question is no longer able to generate during those hours and therefore loses value. ELCC will continue to change in response to load changes and as other types of resources are added to the system. But the takeaway here is that unit accreditation is not static and becomes yet another factor that the portfolio has to solve for over time. So now that we've had a brief introduction into some of the high-level concepts of resource planning, Yessie has a question for everyone on what aspects we should perhaps dive deeper into in the future.
Yes, thank you so much, Shannon. And since we are also halfway through the content, I want to use this also as a little bit of a check-in. I wanted to remind everyone as well that you can go on the project web page, OCC, and answer these poll questions there. I'll make sure that the poll questions in that survey section are launched by noon tomorrow. So if you're having issues accessing the polls or answering them, you can go there and submit your feedback. All right, so on to this poll question. Which part of the planning process feels hardest to understand without seeing all of the details? So your options are, and again, pick your top one when I launch the poll. Number one, is it hard to see how power generation resources are compared? So is it hard to see how one type of generation compares to another? Option number two, is it hard to see how future uncertainty is accounted for? Option three, is it hard to see how environmental outcomes are valued? Or option four, is it hard to see how constraints limit our options? And I am launching the poll now. All right, it looks like number one, we have meeting community and environmental expectations is in the lead. Or no, sorry, that was the wrong. Okay. How environmental outcomes are valued is in the lead right now, and then followed by how future uncertainty is accounted for. And then number three is how constraints limit options. All right. Thank you, folks, for the feedback so we can improve how we communicate and present this information. On that same note, please, just a reminder, make sure you are dropping questions in the Q&A feature. If you need anything clarified, don't wait until the end. Now, Shannon, any thoughts on these results? Otherwise, I'm excited for you to tell us more about other resources and their attributes. It's actually my favorite slide.
Sure, great. Yep, good to see these answers, and definitely a difficult thing to answer. The planning process is certainly very complex, and some solutions may seem obvious on first impression. However, when you consider the regulatory constraints, the resource adequacy requirements, reliability contributions, and generation capabilities of each type of resource, real-time capacity and loading of transmission and distribution systems, market economics, uncertainty of real-time load, and resulting environmental impacts of each potential component that we may be adding to the portfolio, and then how those interact with one another. It certainly becomes obvious instead that this is kind of a multi-dimensional puzzle with shifting pieces. So the responses here kind of serve as a great reminder of topics where we can offer some supporting information in the next workshop. So thank you for those answers. So now we'll transition to consider and discuss some of the modeling inputs and assumptions. So on the next slide, we turn our attention to some of those crucial model inputs, but first we'll take a look at the resources we will enter into the model for selection in the capacity expansion of our portfolio. It's very important to acknowledge and to communicate during this process the trade-offs inherent with every resource that will be available to the model for selection. This table is an illustration of the relative value of resource options according to various criteria which are listed across the top of the table. The variation in the table shows that not only is there no perfect resource, but the portfolio needs resource diversity to accumulate all of the needed components. In the table, green represents a relative benefit, red represents a relative challenge, and yellow means either that the relative value falls in the middle of the range or that the value changes under different circumstances. The model will look at future needs of the system and be able to develop the system capabilities to meet those needs using both the supply side options that you see here on the top of the list, anything from coal and gas units to wind, solar, nuclear resources, as well as demand side options shown on the bottom of the list, which include energy efficiency, demand response, and distributed generation. Our goal is to feed the model with the details of each type of resource and allow the needs of the system to determine the resources that are the most valuable to build into the portfolio. And again, the message of the slide is not any one individual characteristic of any one resource, but rather that the model will consider a variety of resources and that each brings relative challenges and relative benefits. These will all be measured and evaluated against one another, allowing the model to select future resources to optimize the portfolio as a whole. The trade-off between these needed characteristics is why we continue to expand the portfolio in several different directions simultaneously. We're adding thermal baseload, thermal peaking, renewables, storage, distributed resources, and even demand-side customer solutions. Because affordability is also top of mind, on the next slide, we'll take a look at that, along with always looking at reliability and environmental sensitivity. The resource costs are a very important input into the model. With this emphasis, we take a very robust look at cost inputs, including the data sources that we use for those costs. For purchase power agreements, where we contractually purchase capacity and energy from a facility rather than owning and maintaining it, we use real offer prices that our generation strategies and origination team has received from developers. For owned resources, we commissioned a study last year with 1898 & Company, which included capital costs and operating costs for a wide variety of resources. To augment that cost information from the study, we compared against several publicly available data sources such as EIA and NREL. We also gathered benchmark data from other utilities who have recently constructed similar projects and utilized E3's benchmark data as well. E3 then took that current year cost data and projected it to future years using forecasts of equipment and material costs, as well as future expectations for tariffs and tax credits to create a cost curve throughout the model time horizon. This will be input into the model so that an accurate cost is assigned to each resource for evaluation in each model year. So then on the next slide, you can see these cost curves. I'm sorry, first we're going to do the equations. I'm a slide ahead of myself. First, let's talk about how we look at the different cost bases. The calculated cost curves are input into the model for each resource. Costs vary considerably from one type of resource to another, but as we explained previously, the value we receive from each resource in terms of capacity and energy also varies. The middle graph there is a reminder that some resource types provide high accredited capacity and others provide high energy generation, as we discussed a couple slides ago. So to compare the cost of the resources that would be selectable by the model, we have to compare the total cost of the resource, both the initial capital cost and the ongoing operating and maintenance cost, against the amount of capacity or the amount of energy the resource provides to the portfolio, not just the cost, but the value that we get for that cost. This slide explains that for comparison purposes, we look at the levelized cost of effective capacity, or the total cost per year that we would pay for each kilowatt of accredited capacity from the resource, and the levelized cost of energy, or the total cost per operating hour that we would pay for each megawatt hour of generation from the resource. The equations just summarize that we're looking at the same total cost of the resource, but then showing that either on a cost per unit of accredited capacity basis or on a cost per unit of energy basis. So keep this in mind as we now look at those cost metrics on the next slide. So on this slide, we'll look at each resource's levelized cost on the basis of capacity on the left and on an energy basis on the right, which illustrates how the cost we pay for each type of resource looks different when we consider its capacity value or its energy value. Seeing the levelized cost of capacity and the levelized cost of energy side by side clearly illustrates the differences between the resource types. Two examples that I'll point out. If you look at the cost of an aeroderivative gas unit in the solid reddish pinkish line, because those units have a high capacity accreditation, the cost is spread over more megawatts, and the result is on the low end compared to other resources on the left side, the capacity basis side. But then if you follow that over to the energy side, these units aren't dispatched very often, and that low level of energy generation means the levelized cost of energy is high compared to other resource types. Conversely, look at the wind in the dashed bright blue line. Wind receives low resource accreditation. So even though the capital and operating costs of wind are somewhat low, the cost per unit of accredited capacity rises up to the middle of the stack. And then if you follow that wind line over to the energy graph, you can see how the high energy generation of wind assets drops down the cost compared to other resource types. So again, the need for capacity and energy and the relative cost of each is all considered in the model as it aims to optimize the portfolio in terms of resource adequacy, reliability, and economics. And of course, we always want to find low-cost capacity and low-cost energy, which is why efforts have recently revolved around combustion turbines, combined cycle units, wind, and solar. And as a note, we are finalizing some of these costs with additional data sources, but we don't expect the relative position of these costs to change. So moving on to another cost item on the next slide, fuel costs are typically one of the most impactful components of a unit's operating costs. So we've also included a look here at projected future fuel costs that will be input into the model. As you can see on the graph, we're including cost forecasts for coal, natural gas, fuel oil, green hydrogen, and biodiesel. The data for projections come from publicly available sources, E3's research into fuel prices, OPPD's internal forecasts, and our actual fuel and transportation contracts. A few things to note here. First, for options that allow units to fire on renewable fuels, because of supply uncertainty around both fuels, a blend of biodiesel and green hydrogen will be used in the model. Also, for reliability of our gas units, recent installations have included backup fuel oil. To maintain that same level of reliability, costs will be included for all gas resource options to account for either on-site fuel oil storage or firm natural gas transportation in the base scenarios, and sensitivities will be included to capture costs for the alternative options where appropriate. And lastly, knowing that natural gas infrastructure costs can be considerable in proportion to the total project cost, and that the existing gas system will likely require expansion to accommodate future gas units, we have included assumptions around those costs of expanded infrastructure as well. On the next slide, another important model input is the amount of capacity of each technology type that will be available to the model for capacity expansion selection. And in this determination, there are two competing interests. First, we need to allow the model a sufficient amount of capacity in order to truly optimize the portfolio, not just enough to cover resource adequacy, but enough to get the optimal resource mix and reliably serve load. But secondly, at the same time, we can't commit to unrealistic levels of build that might not be feasible from an internal resource perspective. So how do we balance the potential availability for capacity expansion from a modeling lens and from the lens of what the organization can feasibly execute? The funnel graphic on this slide illustrates the methodology of how we determine the available capacity per technology. We start with the total technological potential, and then we apply known constraints. We know that not all initiated projects make it through the SPP study queue through to operation. We also know that other utilities are growing as well and will need some of the available resources. And then lastly, history has shown us that the impacts of external constraints to development, like permitting, zoning, and other regulatory challenges, can reduce the amount of developable potential. So all of these constraints reduce the initial technical potential down to a developable potential. And then the last step is to reduce the developable potential to match what we've been able to execute on historically per technology. However, when we looked at the OPPD executable capacity and compared that against our future accredited capacity needs, we found that the amount isn't sufficient to serve the load forecast obligations and won't allow the model to solve. So to solve that deficiency, we can go one of two ways. We can restrict load growth in the model, or we can expand the available capacity. So instead of only allowing the model to select the OPPD executable capacity, we expanded the availability to include all of the developable potential. These available capacity inputs will distinguish between what is executable by OPPD and what will require a separate type of execution, either a partnership with another utility, partnerships with customers, or other contracting arrangements to procure resources that exceed internal abilities in construction, supply chain, or contracting. And then on the next slide, this is where we land by utilizing that methodology and applying the constraints that we discussed. First, very important to level set that the numbers on this slide are the total capacity that is available to be selected by the model, not a representation of need or a representation of actual expansion selected by the model. The model will select from these total volumes to optimize reliability and cost within the requirements for resource adequacy. It's important to note that in the near-term years, we're reflecting a portion of the actual generation projects entered into the SPP interconnection queue as a realistic expectation of portfolio additions. The graph shows the resulting cumulative capacity availability by resource technology by year, with the OPPD executable capacity in the darker shade of each color and the partnership opportunity capacity in the lighter shade of each color. The cumulative nature of the graph illustrates that the year the capacity is shown is the earliest year the model can select, and any unselected capacity will remain available to the model in subsequent years. Now, at this point, we'll take another break for Yessie to check in with everyone on your impressions of supply-side resource expansion. Yessie?
Hello, yes, folks, we want to know what you think is the biggest challenge to resource development. You can only pick one option from the list, and your options are 1, supply chain or equipment availability, 2, engineering and construction labor resource availability, 3, planning/zoning regulations, 4, grid interconnection regulatory study backlog. Option 5 is grid expansion requirements, or option 6, feasibility and maturity of emerging technology. So I'm launching the poll now. Pick your top favorite. All right. It looks like we have closely tied. Oh, we've got 3 that are kind of battling for the top spot. Supply chain, engineering and construction, planning and zoning, and then grid interconnection, regulatory study backlog. Ooh, it's a race. All right, if you're still putting in your response, go ahead and do that. And again, thank you for this feedback, everyone. Now, you all know that in the ways of the world, supply is impacted directly by demand, and we talked about supply. So now, Shannon, what do we need to know about demand?
Sure. It's important to note that a lot of those same challenges that Yessie just gave you as options there also apply to expansion of demand side management and customer solutions. So demand side management, or DSM, potential is evaluated in a manner similar to supply side options. We begin by estimating the technical potential of various programs and technologies. This allows us to screen out options that aren't feasible for our service area or that lack meaningful magnitude of demand or energy savings. From there, we assess which programs we can realistically support from an organizational standpoint. We work with our product development and marketing team to narrow the universe of potential measures to those with a high likelihood of customer adoption. Next, we estimate how many customers are actually able and likely to adopt these technologies. For example, for rooftop solar, we developed a model to estimate adoption likelihood based on installation cost and payback period. In this way, we're not only determining the technical potential, but also grounding it in customer behavior and leveraging data from internal sources and other utilities to estimate what is realistically available for the model to select. The projections we show on the slide here are incremental to growth in existing programs. That's an important note. In the moderate growth scenario, we assume growth in demand response and distributed resources. Then in the high growth scenario, we're including additional future expansion and higher assumed adoption rates of demand response, distributed resources, and energy efficiency according to the calculated future developable potential. And again, these are not actual expansion numbers or model selections, but rather the total that the model can select as it optimizes the portfolio as a whole to serve the load forecast scenarios. Ultimately, the optimization model will choose the measures that are economically viable. Our role in this exercise is determining what is possible. So on the next slide, the model is not just selecting capacity expansion options in a volume, it's selecting new resources to be added to our existing and projected portfolio. Therefore, we have to inform the model on our existing generation fleet and each unit's operating parameters. In the last workshop, we talked about the assumptions we're inputting into the model for our existing units. For modeling purposes, we established planning horizon assumptions for each unit in our existing fleet. The planning horizons are decision points for future conversion or replacement in planning models, but are not technical end-of-life dates. Planning horizons establish timelines for when decisions about resources need to be made so we can maintain adequate resource capacity and properly plan the system. OPPD has commissioned studies of several existing units to calculate the maintenance schedules and associated costs as we continue operation. From that information, empirical evidence of our own units and similar operating units, and knowledge of common systems and limiting factors at each site, we've established these base case assumptions for the planning horizons. These base model assumptions are not actual plans that we're making for conversion, retirement, or extension projects. They're just starting modeling assumptions that trigger a decision point where the model can select alternate options for the existing units. The model will have the option to select replacement, repair, to extend the operation, retirement, thermal power upgrades, or fuel conversions to either natural gas or renewable fuels. These options will be available only in the years that align with the planning horizon and estimated project times, but will be available in all modeling scenarios. We've shown the portfolio with those assumed model dates here on this graphic, with the nameplate resource capacity in gray. You can see a significant drop-off of capacity in the out years as we fold in those planning horizons, as well as termination dates for existing PPAs. Therefore, the light blue shaded area represents capacity that can be retained in connection with existing units by either extending past the current planning horizon date or by execution of a conversion, a replacement project, or a repower of an existing purchase power agreement. Or the model can select another resource for the required capacity and energy based on those optimization results. As mentioned previously, the action plan that will be recommended as an outcome of the ISP will include only a 10-year period. Within that action plan timeline, the only base case assumption for modification of existing units is a North Omaha retirement and conversion as directed by our board of directors. On the next slide, lastly, there are model inputs related to the integration of generation, transmission, and distribution modeling. As a reminder again, OPPD and the state of Nebraska are part of the SPP Regional Transmission Organization. SPP oversees the regional wholesale energy market and regional transmission expansion planning, among other things. So as part of our ISP modeling framework, we need to account for resource adequacy, the energy market, and the capability of the transmission grid. Being part of the SPP interconnected transmission grid and energy market allows OPPD to consider resource options within the SPP region beyond just the OPPD service territory. But there are distinct differences between the costs and values of an on-system resource and an off-system resource. We've set up our modeling framework to account for transmission grid limitations and expansion options to evaluate resources that are located both on and off OPPD's system and to capture the differences in cost and transmission capabilities with constraints on real-time imports and exports and total annual import reliance. As Dan mentioned earlier, we've provided additional detail in the appendix of this presentation regarding the SPP transmission grid modeling framework for those that are interested in reviewing more detail on that when we post those slides on the Community Connect ISP page. So at this point, I'll now hand it over to our partners at E3 to discuss model scenario development.
Thank you very much, Shannon. Good evening, everyone. My name is Aaron Burdick. I'm a Senior Director at E3, Energy and Environmental Economics. We are a consulting firm that OPPD has hired to help support the development of this integrated system plan. The next section that I'll be presenting is about the modeling scenarios that we are proposing to study in this effort. And if you go to the next slide, you can see the 3 key scenario levers that we teed up as part of workshop 1. So this will look familiar to folks who attended that workshop. And those 3 levers consist of policy. So we want through this process to study the trade-offs of moving faster or slower to achieve the long-term net zero carbon by 2050 target that the OPPD board has established. Demand. So recognizing there is uncertainty in the future level of load growth, we want to understand the impact of different scenarios of new loads in the OPPD service footprint. And then technology. So here we want to understand both how mature technologies that are commercialized at scale today can be part of OPPD's planning portfolio, as well as whether there's a role for new emerging technologies that are not commercialized at scale today, but may become commercialized within the planning horizon that we're studying in this project. Next slide, please. So starting off with load growth, we teed up this topic as well in workshop 1. And in that workshop, we presented 2 different load forecasts that were proposed. So those were the green line here, the moderate load growth scenario. That includes near-term firm customer commitments and a moderate projection of future new requests. And then the high load growth scenario that includes a larger quantity of yet unidentified future requests. We also heard from customers an interest in looking at a potentially a lower load growth scenario where there are fewer large loads added to the OPPD system. So that scenario was added, and you can see that in orange at the bottom of the slide. So that represents the growth that's expected near term, but then a return to the more historical annual average growth rate in the long run of just over 2% per year. This is a scenario that could be conceptualized as either few new large loads are added to the OPPD system, or if large loads are added to the system, they would be bringing their own generation. And this concept of bringing your own generation is part of the national dialogue around new large industrial loads, as well as some of the dialogue within Nebraska. So we thought that adding this scenario was appropriate to represent some of those conversations. So in this case, if large loads would be added to the system, then it would not be part of OPPD's planning to build and plan for generation for those loads. Instead, they would be bringing their own generation to support their growth. Next slide. So next up on policy. So now we'd like to talk about the trajectory for meeting the net zero carbon emissions goal. So the goal has been set by OPPD's board for achievement in 2050, but there is a question of how quickly OPPD should progress towards meeting that goal. So that's what we've shown here, 2 scenarios of that trajectory on the figure. In orange, you can see the projected near-term emissions, the net electric emissions for OPPD's portfolio. And then you see a straight line trajectory in blue, and then a moderated trajectory in green. You also see the call out for no greenhouse gas target. That is not consistent with the current OPPD board policy, but it's an important scenario for us to model such that we have a point of comparison for understanding the costs and the resource needs associated with a just economic scenario versus one that enforces the board adopted clean energy policy. And as I'll tee up on the next slide, having these two trajectories is going to be important when we think about the high levels of load growth that some of these scenarios will be considering. So if we combine the greenhouse gas trajectory, which is tons CO2 per year, with the load growth trajectory, we can create the figure on the right hand of this slide. What this figure is showing is the reduction in the emissions intensity, so the tons of CO2 per megawatt hour served by OPPD. And we've drawn 6 different lines there. These are representing 6 of the scenarios that we plan to study. The scenarios differ in the level of load growth that we're modeling. So you can see those 3 colors representing the 3 load growth scenarios, as well as the pace of greenhouse gas reduction. So the straight line to 2050 versus the moderated case. And what you can see is under the green and blue scenarios, which feature higher load growth, particularly in the near term, the emissions intensity reduction is significant in the near term versus the scenarios with lower levels of load growth has a more straight line pathway towards the 2050 net zero carbon target. So studying this range of scenarios will help us to understand the level of resource needs as well as the cost impacts of different greenhouse gas trajectories across different load growth futures. Next slide, please. And then the third lever is around technology scenarios. So for new technologies, we want to look at 3 different scenarios in this project. We're going to look at a mature technology future. So this is one, as I mentioned earlier, that focuses on resource options that are commercialized at scale today. So these include what we typically see getting built in Nebraska and in the Southwest Power Pool. So new solar and wind projects, battery storage, new natural gas, as well as some of the other technologies that Shannon mentioned earlier, including the demand side options. We're also going to look at a scenario of emerging technologies. In this scenario, we will allow the model to select from technologies that are still emerging in their commercialization. So these include nuclear, new nuclear, such as small modular reactors, as well as different flavors of carbon capture and storage that would be added to existing coal plants or new natural gas plants. And we also make a hydrogen fuel technology available in that scenario. And then the third technology future that we will consider focuses specifically on nuclear in absence of those other emerging technologies. So that will be considering the potential role of nuclear in OPPD's future portfolio. And then the last bullet on the bottom there, extended asset life. So this applies to not new technology options, but to the options that we plan to make available for existing OPPD generating assets in the model. And Shannon got at this on her slide a bit earlier, but just to reemphasize, for existing assets, we plan to allow the model to optimally select their retirement, their continued retention, or their conversion to other technologies. So that could include the conversion from combusting coal to running on natural gas and the associated emission reductions, as well as the addition of carbon capture and storage in the emerging technology scenario added to existing generating assets. Next slide, please. So we talked about each of these 3 levers. Each of them have 3 different core scenarios that we'll be considering. So for emissions, there are the 2 trajectories to reach net zero by 2050. We also have the reference no policy target case for a point of comparison. There is the low, moderate, and high load growth scenarios. And then the 3 technology availability scenarios we talked about, mature plus nuclear, and the mature plus emerging. So if we combine these into our proposed scenario matrix that is shown on the next slide. So here you could see the reference scenario. This is our point of comparison without a clean energy policy in force. That would be run using mature technologies on the moderate growth scenario. And then the next 6 rows represent those 6 lines that I mentioned earlier. So these are different combinations of the 3 load growth scenarios and the 2 greenhouse gas trajectory scenarios. And then the last 2 rows on this table represent the nuclear future and the emerging technology future that we plan to explore as well. And then lastly, on the bottom, there is a note around sensitivity analyses that we are considering, including the assumptions around fuel costs, such as natural gas prices, technology costs, such as how much new solar, wind, and battery storage resources will cost, as well as scenarios around the SPP market and the associated accreditation metrics for some of the new technologies we're considering. And that concludes the section today on the proposed scenarios. And with that, I will hand it back over to Yessi.
Thank you, Aaron. Yes, we have so many scenarios and interesting plots and stories we could be predicting. So I want to ask you all, where do you want decision makers to be most bold? Where are you okay with leaders pushing a bit more? Again, only pick your #1 favorite, but your options are #1, speed of emissions reductions. Option 2, minimizing reliability impacts. Option 3, designing pathways that remain viable over time. Option 4, investing early in emerging technologies. 5, planning for higher-end load growth projects. 6, building for projected load growth, even if adjustments are needed later. Or 7, accounting for cost and implementation challenges. So I'm launching the poll now. Okay, let's see. So far, the top option is designing pathways that remain viable over time. Oh, and it just got beat out by speed of emissions reductions. So those are our top 2, and the rest are kind of tied. So we've got 2 favorites by the group. Okay. All right. This is great feedback, everybody. Thank you very much. But we do have more work for you after today. So let's review a little bit before we go over our homework again. So after today, make sure that you understand these next takeaways that I will summarize. But also make sure you go back to this next slide, the takeaway slide. It's slide 48 for those of you calling in. This will be kind of your study guide as you go and do give us your feedback and do your homework, if you will. So first, remember that we have considered many things in this model. So before the model spits out suggestions or future scenarios, we're making sure that it's considering resources, transmission and distribution on the supply and demand side, all while also making sure it considers regulatory requirements. The second main point is basically that we used a variety of data sources as inputs as well. The third main point is that there will be different variations of scenarios that come from the modeling because we, you and I, need to see how trade-offs will impact us in the future. If we do more or less of one thing, does that create more or less for this other consideration? And fourth, the ISP will conclude with portfolio recommendations focusing on a no regrets approach in the 10-year horizon, including guidance on the North Omaha station. Phew, that is a lot, but we did have more content to cover today than last time. So before we move on, Professor Dan, is there anything else? Did I cover everything correctly, accurately? Dan is not saying anything.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
and
Can you
got
hear
the
me?
thumbs up.
Yep.
Yes.
Sorry, it was
All right.
late.
No.
Yes, no, I think you covered it well. I would probably just end with, I know there was various questions we've been receiving kind of throughout this presentation, and I know this is a pretty deep dive technical presentation, talking a lot about the different technology options we're going to look at, how we came up with the different data inputs and assumptions that feed into the model along with the modeling framework, and then how we're looking at different scenarios, because there are uncertainties with planning for the future, and the scenarios are going to help us look at those different impacts. So just wanted you to kind of end with that, the key takeaways here, and that some of the maybe more deeper dive technical questions, if we don't have an answer to you right away in the Q&A section of the WebEx, we will look to answer those after the workshop tonight. So again, just thanks for being engaged, especially with all the questions, and appreciate your attendance.
Thank you, Dan. Let's advance to that slide I promised we would bring up again, because it explains exactly what we need from you after today. So by June 5th, we need you all to please go to oppdcommunityconnect.com/ISP and tell us what you think about the conclusions we drew. Do you agree with our assumptions? Why or why not? We need your help narrowing down which technology we should consider and what direction the model should focus on when spitting out those future scenarios. As a reminder, we will post the video recording, a PDF executive summary, and a PDF of the PowerPoint from today's webinar on that webpage. When we have a date selected, we will also have a link for you to register for the third webinar. Again, we plan to have the third webinar sometime in September. Now, it looks like we are past 6 p.m. and I wanted to be mindful of everyone's time, as we originally wanted this to end at 6. So thank you all very much again for taking time out of your evening to be a part of this process and help shape our energy future. Have a great night, everyone.